honored to have an opportunity to introduce one of my favorite historians and one of our field's most important scholars today, Sarah Abrevaya Stein. Oh, sorry, didn't mean to move. No, I wouldn't do that.
Spoiler! Stealing her thunder already.
No, I'm not going to give away Sarah's surprises. I'm just going to tell you a little bit about all that she's already done before this talk that will undoubtedly surprise us. Sarah's professor of history and Jewish studies at UCLA, where she holds the Viterbi Family Endowed Chair in Mediterranean Jewish Studies, and is also the Sadia and Ludwig Kahn Director of the Alan D. Leve Center for Jewish Studies. She received her BA at Brown and her PhD at Stanford, where she studied under Aaron Rodrigue and Steven Zipperstein. Someone once told me, one of your classmates, Sarah, that when Sarah arrived at Stanford, she was already a historian, and so she just needed to become a better one. But this was in context of who had trained different people. Well, Sarah was already a historian, so she didn't really need to be trained by Rowan and Steve. As you might gather from that description and her multiple titles, she is one of the most eminent scholars of Jewish studies, really of our time. She's a leading scholar in the fields of Sefardic studies, modern Jewish history, and Jews of the Middle East and North Africa. She's the recipient of numerous fellowships, prizes, and awards, including multiple NEH fellowships, a Guggenheim, multiple National Jewish Book Awards, and multiple National Jewish Book Award finalists awards, a UCLA Distinguished Teaching Award, and the Samuel Rohr Prize in Jewish Literature. Sarah's the author or co-editor of 10 books, thematically spanning a stunning range of topics in modern Jewish studies and crisscrossing the Mediterranean and large parts of Europe, the Middle East, North Africa, and beyond. And now I'm going to tell you a little bit about each of those 10 books. No, I'm not, don't worry. Sarah's corpus is beyond impressive, so what I'd like to do is try to give a sense of what I regard as her greatest impacts upon the field of Jewish studies for just a moment. I think Sarah's done more than any living scholar to bring the experience of Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews, Jews of the Mediterranean and Jews of both Levant and North Africa, to bear upon how we understand many facets of the modern Jewish experience. When I entered graduate school, the perspective on so many fields in modern Jewish studies was remarkably Eurocentric, Ashkenazic-centric. Today that's changed fundamentally, and Sarah's work shows us in great part how and why. For I would say nearly every major issue in modern Jewish history, Sarah has complicated the story by introducing the Sephardic experience and using it to reframe part of the question. She did this for Jews in Modernity with her first book, Making Jews Modern, the Yiddish and Ladino Press in the Russian and Ottoman Empires, where she compared press outlets that had never been analyzed together, and she emphasized the crucial context of empire for vast areas of modern Jewish culture. She did it for Jews in Capital with her book Plumes, Ostrich Feathers, Jews in a Lost World of Global Commerce, where she follows Jews through the rise and fall of the feather trade across 3 continents. She did it for legal emancipation with Extraterritorial Dreams, European Citizenship, Sephardic Jews, and the Ottoman 20th Century, where she showed how Jews of the Ottoman Empire operated along an uncertain and ever-shifting spectrum of legal status that they hung on to long after the empire collapsed. In Saharan Jews and the Fate of French Algeria, she pushes the story of Jews in empire farther south to emphasize the way that the same territories where racial hierarchy could elevate Jews could also be a place where Jews were relegated to the bottom of the colonial order and constructed as indigenous, and she pushed us to interrogate archives as not only sites of knowledge, but also knowledge production in ways that few Jewish historians have done. Most recently, she's co-edited 2 books on North Africa and its Jews during World War II and the Holocaust that provide us unprecedented scholarly and documentary perspective on this long-forgotten aspect of the history of World War II and the Shoah. She's done much the same for Jews and family sagas across the 20th century, a veritable genre in both scholarly and popular writing about Ashkenazic Jews with family papers, a Sephardic journey through the 20th century. Secondly, in all of these cases, she has followed the sort of famous dictum of Gerda Lerner with regard to gender history, which was to not just add Sephardic studies and stir, so to speak. She's really used that lens to reframe and ask us to rethink these fundamental questions in Jewish history. I also think that she's pushed the field in more imaginative directions with regard to the meaning of citizenship, with regard to how we think about material objects, with regard to archives, with regard to geographical boundaries and crossing those boundaries. And in some ways, I think through that, the various themes of her work and these different approaches, she's really done a lot to mainstream a series of cultural studies approaches that were really pioneered by people like David Beale, and to implant them in Jewish politics, Jewish society, other fields of Jewish studies, even to some degree in institutional histories. Through all of this, she's also a remarkably generous colleague and mentor. Sarah never made me feel like she was a mentor to me because she treated me like a colleague from the first time that we met, even though I was so much more junior than she, and I know many others have had the same experience. So it's an extraordinary pleasure to welcome her. We're looking forward to learning more from her with Swimming Through History, her lecture this evening.
Thank you, Ethan. That's a really kind introduction. I taught your work recently, and one of my students said, Professor Katz writes really long, and I'm really honored to be the receiving end of your loquacious generosity and integrity, so thank you.
Well played.
No, that's very kind. So Sam, Dina, thank you so much for this opportunity. Everyone, it's been wonderful learning from you today. And this talk goes out to David, my fellow swimmer, my fellow love of swimming. You'll see why. The first time Alfred Nakache died, it was in the gas chambers of Auschwitz. The second time, it was in the water, where he was most at home. The Olympian swimmer had a style that appears rough by contemporary standards. His pace lags far behind the intergalactic speeds of contemporary Olympians. He would easily be lapped by Léon Marchand, Michael Phelps, or Katie Ledecky. But in the 1930s and 40s, Nakache devastated the competition. The French press referred to him lovingly by the nickname Artem the Fish. He was known for his power, technique, and his water feel, that ineffable intimacy with water that swimmers prize. All this was before the racist and anti-Semitic policies of the Vichy French regime and the expanding vicious dragnet of the Third Reich murdered Nakache for the first time. Today, I'd like to introduce you to Nakache's story as a means of thinking about the porous line that divides life and death, and the ways it can be crossed repeatedly in a single lifetime. This is true in Nakache's case, not only because he experienced a resurrection of sorts, but because his life and his death, like the lives and deaths of many other North African Jewish victims of the Shoah, have been excised from Jewish history. And not only Jewish history, but North African history, Holocaust history, and French history. Nakache's life, one could say, is marked by a double death to the power of 4. In addition to reflecting on the possibility of exponential Jewish deaths, I want to reflect today on water as a current of Jewish history. And here, I confess, I am merging 2 distinct projects. You'll tell me whether I'm doing so clunkily or not. I am merging 2 distinct projects that I had been conceptualizing separately, but which the mandate of this workshop has encouraged me to think about together. For separately from Nakache's story, I have been brooding on how Mediterranean Jews experienced the elements, earth, air, fire, and water, and considering how the Mediterranean in its very physicality shaped Jewish culture. This story has long taproots. A work of 18th century Ladino Musar, ethical literature, warned of the dangers of relaxing with a bottle of cold wine, quote, near springs or water or ponds or rivers under a pear tree or a fig tree or any green tree, because this practice was sure to lead to excessive drinking, libidinous activity, and puking. Yet still, or perhaps all the more, for many Jews of the modern Mediterranean, enjoying water, taking the waters, immersing in water was irresistible. Quote, oh my God, we were practically born in the water, you know, remembered Irving Benveniste, a Jewish native of the island of Rhodes. And indeed, Mediterranean Jews used water to articulate religious praise. They indulged in it. They used it, sometimes showily, to mark class. They welcomed it as a backdrop for the rejection of gender norms and for the articulation of a new muscular Judaism. They embraced water as a space that brought family together and to shape Mediterranean Jewish comings of age. Those slides took me about 6 years to pull together, so I, put it up. Thank you. Okay, archival ratdom. It slowly pays off. The fruits come slowly. But these experiences of water, I contend, were all means for Mediterranean Jews to live as Mediterraneans. But water also allowed Jewish exit, reflected Jewish absence, facilitated Jewish genocide, and in cases allowed for the embodiment of defiant survival. For swimmers like Nakache, water also served, and here I'm really drawing from the description of this conference. For swimmers like Nakache, water also served as the space between inhale and exhale. Today, I would like to use Nakache's story to tell a Mediterranean Jewish history of water and to visit unresolved questions that hover at the line between stability and vulnerability, solidity and liquidity, themes I think that are central to this conference. So to this end, I want to carry us somewhat gradually to the story of France's role during the Second World War in the deportation from France of North African-born Jews and their French-born children, like Nakache. These Holocaust victims have been overlooked in the face of post-war French and Shoah myth-making, just as Nakache's own odyssey has been obscured by a hagiographic and partial depiction of the French champion, and perhaps by Jewish historians' lack of engagement with water as a medium of storytelling. Alfred Nakache was born in Constantine, Algeria in 1915, one of 10 children in a traditional Jewish family. According to the Crémieux Decree of 1870, the children, like the vast majority of Jewish subjects of French rule in colonial Algeria, were granted French citizenship upon their birth, thereby accessing rights and privileges denied most of their Muslim neighbors. We don't know what inspired Nakache's parents to give their boy swimming lessons. Even in the athletically inclined city of Constantine, this was a rarity. But in the city's Ain Sidi Mesed pool, one of the oldest pools in North Africa, Nakache trained alongside Muslim, Christian, and other Jewish boys. He proved a phenom, winning gold at the North African Championship in 100-meter freestyle at 16 years of age. Constantine was a city of athletes. Large numbers of European settlers had moved to the Algerian city at the turn of the 20th century, bringing with them the boxing ring, which was also a magnet for Jewish boys and men, the swimming pool, and a violent streak of anti-Semitism. In the late summer of 1934, the city witnessed the most intense anti-Jewish violence known to the region. Right-wing European Christian settlers consciously inflamed tensions between local Muslims and Jews in an effort to thwart political reform in French colonial Algeria, and the riot left 25 Jews and 3 Muslims dead, emotionally shattering the diverse city. A year before violence racked his hometown, however, Nakache had moved to train with the Racing Club of Paris, joining a large community of émigré North African Jews and Muslims in France. The young man's rise was meteoric. Nakache placed second in the 100-meter freestyle at the 1934 French Nationals. Between 1935 and 1938, he earned 7 French national titles, and between 1941 and 1942, 6 more. Nakache represented France and Morocco at the second Maccabia Games in Tel Aviv in 1935 in 100-meter freestyle and water polo, respectively. And I'll explain parenthetically that a show of what my colleague Todd Pressner has called muscular Judaism, the 1932 and 1935 Maccabia Games were promoted as proof of the possibility of Jewish national regeneration. And for this reason were opposed, the ones in Tel Aviv, by both the British Mandate regime and the Arab Palestinian press. And numerous participating athletes, including the entire Bulgarian delegation chose not to return to their country of origin after these games were over. At the notorious 1936 Olympics in a swastika-draped Berlin, Nakache helped the French win fourth in the 4x200-meter relay. Most German Jewish and other so-called non-Aryan athletes were barred from competition, but Jewish athletes and black athletes, at least those who did not boycott the event, proudly defied Nazi racial theories under the furious gaze of the Fuhrer. In the years that followed, Nakache won the freestyle on the French national stage a staggering 6 times, the breaststroke 4 times. In July of 1941, he earned a world record, the first one set by a French swimmer, in a long sea course in Marseille. His record-setting time would stand for 5 years. But this is a timeline viewed from the water. France and the continent were following quite another. Nakache's stunning success as a competitive swimmer ran parallel to the rise of Nazism in Europe and the unfurling of anti-Semitic and racist legislation and, in time, genocidal policy across Europe and, of course, North Africa as well. With war in the air, Nakache interrupted his training in 1939 to join the French Air Force, serving for 10 months in Algeria, 127 kilometers west of his native Constantine. He returned in July of 1940 to an occupied Paris. A month earlier, the aging First World War hero, Marshal Henri-Philippe Pétain, signed an armistice with Germany on behalf of his country. The armistice established German occupation over northern and western France and placed southern France under a new collaborationist regime in the city of Vichy, with Pétain at its head. This authoritarian Vichy government immediately implemented racist and anti-Semitic laws that mimicked, and in some cases actually exceeded, those in place in Nazi Germany. They also rolled out these laws within their occupied territories, including North Africa. The Vichy regime also created concentration camps, internment camps, prison camps, and forced labor camps in France and in territories under its control, North Africa and West Africa included. Still, Nakache was able to continue training, competing, studying for a degree, and teaching physical education at a local high school. Indeed, athletic culture flourished in Vichy France, both actually in Vichy and in the German-occupied zones. French Jewish athletes like Nakache would resist, and of course, many would fall victim to these regimes, but non-Jewish athletes, at least some of them, upheld and advanced the goals of these fascist states. All the while, the World War II-era French public embraced sports and their coverage with undiminished zeal. Some 25,000 Jews abandoned Paris in the spring and summer of 1940 as Nazi forces marched on the capital. Alfred Nakache and his wife Paul, née Elbaz, who was also a competitive swimmer and physical education teacher of Algerian Jewish background, they decided to follow this course, to leave Paris in December of this year, December of 1940. But their flight was not like that of most Jewish refugees. The couple chose Toulouse as a destination because Nakache was welcomed by a swimming club there, the Dauphin du Toulouse Olympique Employé Club, the TOEC. He even assumed a new teaching position in the city. That Nakache was Jewish was not actually much of a mystery. He had competed in the Maccabiah Games only 5 years earlier. His was a relatively common Algerian Jewish name. And what's more, Nakache agreed, somewhat, of course, discreetly, to assist the resistance in Toulouse, helping to train new recruits with physical training and distribute anti-Nazi literature. The swimmer was hiding in the open air, sheltered by his own fame and a few protectors. And so, unexpectedly, Nakache trained, competed, won medals, his exploits covered regularly in the press. Of course, there was negative coverage. The anti-Semitic magazine Le Pilori called him, quote, a supernatural man, this half-god with frizzy hair and wide nostrils, the Jew Artem Nakache, member of the Zionist Association Maccabi, laureate of the Jewish Olympics, unquote. The sports magazines Match and the anti-Semitic magazine Revivre published the same infelicitous cover photo of Nakache, emerging from a swimming pool with his tongue lolling, degenerate. In early winter of 1942, under the urging of the general governor of Algeria, the commission in charge of the Jewish question for the Vichy regime, which was responsible for defining Jewish status and implementing anti-Semitic policy, demanded specifically that Nakache complete the census required of all Jews, and soon that body would ban Jewish athletes from competition. The most extended story of Nakache's life, a French-language biography, centers on the Olympians' rivalry and eventual betrayal by a competitor of Nakache's named Jacques Cartonnet, a zealous member of the Milice Française, the French fascist militia. But even without this anti-hero, Nakache's limbo could not last. In the summer of 1942, the French police detained and interned over 28,000 Jewish men and foreign and stateless Jewish women, men, and children, holding them in the Vélodrome d'Hiver, Paris's most famous indoor stadium. From there, the imprisoned were taken to the Drancy internment camp and deported to Auschwitz. It took France decades to admit to the complicity of French police in the Veldiv roundup. And it was actually only in 1995 that President Jacques Chirac acknowledged the role of the French state and police in carrying out the persecution and deportation of Jews from France. But at the time, the signal was unambiguous. France was complicit in the persecution and deportation of Jews within its territories, and genocide and sports traveled hand in hand. Meanwhile, newspapers across France demanded to know whether the country's greatest swimmer was indeed a Jew, even as Nakache was enlisted to participate in the autumn of 1942 in a propagandistic North African sports tour sponsored by the Vichy regime. Nakache climbed the winner's podium under the watch of the French military commander in Tunisia, General Barré, and Prince Mohammed Raouf Bey, son of the Bey of Tunis, oversaw the event as well. Nakache's body was a machine that both France and North Africa wanted to claim as their own, until they didn't any longer. In August of 1943, the French Swimming Federation banned Nakache from competition. Teammates from the TOC club and a Tunisian team known as ROT forfeited a meet in Toulouse in protest of this decision. And fans demonstrated Nakache's absence under the watchful eye of the Commissioner General for Sports, Colonel Joseph Pascot. And this is quite striking because so public an act of solidarity with a Jewish victim was rare in Europe, in France as elsewhere. With a tip from the French militia, probably by a former competitor, Roland Guibel, the Gestapo arrested Alfred Nakache, his wife Paul, and their toddler Annie in late December of the same year, 43. The adults were held in a prison facility in Toulouse. Annie was temporarily held in a convent and with friends before the entire family was transferred to the Drancy internment camp on the outskirts of Paris. Nazi representatives deported the Nakaches to Auschwitz in January of 1944 on Convoy 66. Alfred, Paul, and Annie Nakache were not deported because they were Jews per se, but because they were so-called foreign Jews and because Nakache aided the resistance. This was true despite the fact that as Algerian Jews, Alfred and Paul had been granted French citizenship at birth, and Annie was born in France, a French citizen per pre-war laws. I'm just trying to emphasize that the French-born and the foreign-born Jews living in France, including those who were from North Africa or who were the children of North African immigrants, were treated differently than the French Jewish native-born. That's the point there. Nakache himself explained that he was charged with, quote, anti-German propaganda because I continued to beat the records of German swimmers. These explanations are mutually complementary, since Nakache's defiant laps in the pool were themselves a form of protest. Paul and Annie were gassed in Auschwitz within 2 weeks of their arrival. Alfred was consigned to forced labor in the camp's Buna Werke rubber plant, the same plant where Primo Levi is a slave laborer. While interned, Nakache is made to dive after daggers in the camp's water tank for the entertainment of Nazi overseers. Elsewhere in Auschwitz, the Tunisian-born boxer Massoud Victor Young Perez was forced to fight for the same reason. Nazi delight in coercing gladiator-esque athleticism upon their once powerful victims upheld their embrace of classical Roman culture. But whereas Perez was murdered in the death camps, and Nakache survived, in the chaos of late war, the French press rumored him dead. That's the first death. But he had in fact survived, being sent on a death march to Buchenwald. At the time of his liberation, Nakache weighed 88 pounds. In Buchenwald, Nakache met Roger Fouché-Cléteau, the brother of a swimmer he knew from Toulouse. With Fouché-Cléteau's help, he put pen to paper for the first time in 15 months. Nakache wrote of how horribly alone he had felt in Auschwitz, where, quote, our, quote unquote, racial brothers tormented us because we didn't know Yiddish, unquote. In a hurried pen, in a simple notebook, Nakache wrote mournfully of the victims, of his betrayer, Jacques Cartonnet, and of the, quote, inescapable vengeance that was due, quote, these barbarians. Nakache did not yet know that his wife and daughter had been murdered. Quote, he wrote, we still have hard times to go through, but resolute, we will reach the new path that a new humanity will chart for itself, unquote. Perhaps more interesting than Nakache's words is his signature, written in Arabic with a smaller French translation by its side. Maktub, it is written, and we make it through by the will of God, Allah. A recent account of Nakache's life naively dismisses Nakache's Arabic afterword as proof of his sense of humor. I can't understand that. But there was something fundamental in this Arabic finale, and in Nakache's rueful reference to his Yiddish-speaking peers. Nakache experienced arrest, internment, deportation, slave labor, the death camp, and a forced march, not only as a Jew, though this too, but also as a North African. It is a point that has been overlooked by all who have explored Nakache's story before, just as, in broader terms, North African Jewish experiences of the Holocaust and of Vichy excess have been excluded from Holocaust history for so long. And here is his signature with the French and Arabic conclusion. Astonishingly, less than a year after Nakache's return, he was competing again. In 1948, he was one of 2 Holocaust survivors to earn a place on an Olympic team. Does anyone know the other? The other one was Ben Helfgott, a Polish Jewish weightlifter. In the London Summer Games, Nakache reached the semifinals in the 200-meter breaststroke and played on France's water polo team, which placed 6th. After the war, the French Swimming Foundation declared that politics and sports should never again mix. This rushed effort to move beyond the organization's dark wartime history was part and parcel of a national French myth-making project championed by President Charles de Gaulle to reinvent French wartime history as a tale of victimhood and resistance. Nakache's erstwhile swimming pool in Toulouse has been named after him. The Bay of Tunis awarded him the Order of Glory. He has been inducted into various halls of fame. A book and various articles, all in French, have focused on his story. A documentary film chronicles his life, and select family members are vigilant in honoring his legacy. History and popular memory, then, have moved beyond post-war mythologies, but the intricacies of the racist and anti-Semitic policies of the Vichy regime, particularly as concerns North Africa and North Africans, are only now coming to light. Fittingly, Nakache died in the water, suffering a heart attack while swimming in the port of Célèbes, less than 100 kilometers as the crow flies from the city of his birth. Water was this Algerian Jew's nursery, his delivery, his triumph, his prison, his revenge, and ultimately his crypt. It was a thing for which he had an ineffable magical feel. But like France, the state that enfranchised Nakache, water could both buoy and drown. The Olympics honor and monetize elite athleticism. And I wrote this, in fact, to be timed with the opening of the Summer Olympics in France. They have also been attended by doping, boycotts, massacres, terrorism, human rights violations, lies, sexual violence, racism, financial malfeasance, the forced transformation of intersex bodies and the bodies of women with high testosterone level. Alfred Nakache's story is triumphalist in its way, but it also illuminates the game's shadow, which ripples across history like water disturbed. Water also ripples through Jewish history, and arguably courses with particular force through Mediterranean Jewish history. As we frame a conversation about life and death, violence and war, vulnerability and fragility, we do well to consider water, not merely as a palimpsest of these phenomena, but as a substance potent with Jewish meaning. Mediterranean Jews did not need to be Olympic swimmers to have a nuanced and abiding relationship to water. Water gave them joy and release, a space for spiritual reinvention, ritual, a route of exit. It was a through line of Mediterranean Jews' lives, but of course it could also ferry them to death, as it did, I'm thinking specifically of the Jews of Rhodes. The connection was widespread, mediated by landscape, locale, class, gender, and much, much more. So deep was this affinity that even in diaspora from the Mediterranean Jews gravitated to places whose waterscapes reminded them of home: Rio de Janeiro, Cape Town, Tel Aviv, Manchester, Montreal, New York, Catalina, Seattle, and this very bay. Thank you so much. I'd be happy, if people have the energy for conversation, I'd be happy to take some questions, but we've had a long and emotional day.
Oh, this is a very trivial question, but Catalina?
Catalina, so I have to write about Catalina, because Catalina, from the 1940s on, was the chosen retreat of the LA Sephardic, Turkish, and Greek, and Rhodesili emigre community. And it looks very much like the islands in the Bosphorus. It looks very much like Buyukada. The flora and the fauna is the same. The curve of the hills are the same. So I actually think there's something powerful here about the allure, the afterlife of terroir, of that relationship to landscape. Please.
Thanks for a wonderful talk, Sarah. I'm wondering if you could just say a little bit more, about what do you think is the particularity of water, which is to say, one could imagine writing about Jews in prairie settings where a certain kind of landscape defines them in many ways parallel to what you said, or Jews in various kinds of urban spaces, perhaps for shorter periods, Jews in forests. So I'm just wondering if you would draw parallels,
right,
or whether
right.
you would say like water is really distinctive.
No, I think this is actually part of a project that I'm provisionally calling Sephardic Elemental, that explores the elements, earth, wind, air, and fire, as they were experienced by Mediterranean Jews. It's not that Jews elsewhere didn't experience these same things, and it's not that non-Jews in the Mediterranean didn't experience these same things. Both are absolutely true. But my hope is that it gives us a unique way to examine Mediterranean Jews' connection to place and space and landscape, and to move away from the urban fetish of historians. So in a way, it's a bit of a conceit, but I think that it opens up some interesting terrain. I've been amazed, as I've already begun to explore the earth, the water, and the air piece of this, and I've been amazed how simply asking the question leads me to sources I had never seen before, And within those sources leads me to queries I've never asked before about bodies and leisure and open air and space and gender and myriad other questions. So I think it's like any critical lens, it is about a reframe that opens up a new possibility, historical possibility. Yeah, thanks. David.
Yeah, so the project reminds me a little bit of Miriam Zadov's book
Yeah.
on the Bohemian
Yes.
spas next year or last year, which is in Marienbad.
In Marienbad.
Yeah, and this idea of leisure and the role of water in leisure. So I think there's a lot here.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, that's such a wonderful book. And leisure, it has been a central aspect of what I want to write about. But what is interesting to me is that leisure is where I started. It was what I first saw. But the more I dug, the more I realized the emotional congestion that took place around water. And this woman pictured here is a friend of mine, in her 90s now. You've met her, Julius. She's actually not Sephardic by origin. She was from Poland, but her family fled during the war to Sarajevo and then hid in Italy. And here you see her pictured in a DP camp. And this just is such a complex photo because it is after the war. She's in a DP camp, which in Italy were these open air environments. And she had an American Jewish emigre cousin who came with this object, a bikini, so it's like it's so complicated because it's the site of liberation, it's survival, it's consumerism and power and the presence of America and a very complex gender dynamic that I really want to think about American GIs having sexual and love relationships with women, Jewish women survivors, which I don't think anyone has really written about before, although it has been written about in France for American GIs and sexual violence in France. But anyway, the point is, sometimes they start to look like leisure, but there's actually so much more at stake. And in that way, I think, relative to the study of the spa culture, it probably will take me in some different directions, but I love that book.
Yeah, such a fascinating talk. I was intrigued by your comment, if I heard right, that the sort of athletic culture that came was really sort of associated with this influx of immigrants from Europe. I'm curious to what extent sports remain seen as sort of like European in this way, and how that like changed perceptions of people like Nakache who were sort of engaged in that, and the place of also like religion versus secularism and Zionism in the ways that North African Jews were engaging with sports culture.
Well, where I see this having an afterlife, and I'm really not a sports junkie, so I'm stretching myself here, but are controversies that erupt on, for example, the soccer field, where if North African players, not Jewish for the most part, who play for France are heroes when they win and they're villains when they lose. And that those accusations of betrayal become tinged with racist, xenophobic tenor. So how did I get there from your question? I'm not exactly sure, but was that in fact an answer? It was meant to be an answer to the first part of your question, but and what was the second thing that you had asked?
Yeah, I'm thinking also about Joel's paper, thinking about like European granting of citizenship to Jews in this way, and the sort of like insidious, complex relations between Christians, Muslims, Jews living in this area in ways that Jews are sort of seen as European in this way through the Alliance, but also through sports. It's like an intriguing.
Right. And you had also asked about, and Ethan is the one who's written so beautifully about this topic, but you had also asked about the importation of certain sports to Algeria with a settler colonial population and along with anti-Semitic violence. And my colleague, Chris Silver, I know has like a 1, 2, 3, 4th book project lined up to write about these boxers. And we're gonna learn so much more from him because I think this is really interesting. The nexus between colonialism, athleticism, and Jews using sports as a vehicle of social ascension and exit, and probably more than that, but at least that, and masculinity, and also nation, and performing the nation. So I think it's, we'll have to learn from Chris, that whole story. Thanks.
So if we're doing the sports thing, Tamir Sorek is writing about Jews and basketball and North African Jews dominating the basketball world in the interwar period. So North African Jews have this dominant position in Egypt and other North African countries in basketball. And then when those of them who go to Israel go there, basketball is Ashkenazi, and soccer, football is Mizrahi, so everything changes around. So look, I've only read an article based on the book, but the book is coming.
Great, I'll write him. Great suggestion. Thanks.
I just have a comment about soccer in Israel. When I was a soccer fan in 2nd and 3rd grade, so this would be 1959, it was completely Ashkenazi. My heroes were Khodrov, Shia Glazer, and Levkovich. It was really not until the 80s when Mizrahi Jews entered the soccer field.
Thank you. Yeshi.
Hey, these are two sort of short questions. One is just a little bit, I don't know the history. You were trying to distinguish between the treatment of North African Jews in France and other Jews in France. And I'm just curious if you could say a little bit more about that. And then the other question is, I don't know if you have an answer to yet, but what the fire section of this earth, air, fire, water might be about.
Okay. Foreign born, okay, and fire, okay, yes. Ethan, you're my check here, but let me see if I can present this properly. The French regime, the French will deport the foreign born. They will count North African Jews even if they had French citizenship on birth, but all refugees from anywhere in Europe, they will deport those Jews, but they mostly will protect the native-born French. And so the rates of survival and rates of annihilation are almost precisely inverse, and this is where I wanted your check. 98% survival of French native-born, 98% destruction of foreign-born is my memory. Too high for the second one, okay.
Given how many Eastern European Jews come in the interwar, and 75,000 Jews overall died.
Okay.
But still,
let's say radically disparate rates of survival and annihilation. So that's what I'm referring to. I didn't talk about this in the talk, but my work with Omar Boom is about the unfolding of Vichy policies in North Africa. And here I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about those North African emigres and their French-born children who are in France. So it's a different story for the Jews and Muslims who fall under the Vichy regime or the Nazi regime or the Italian fascist regime in North Africa. But that's the important distinction I wanted to draw attention to. And fire, I'm trying to tell the biography of a brick. There was a brick factory in the city of Salonika, present-day Thessaloniki, Greece, that was Jewish-owned, that was one of the most important brick and roof tile purveyors across the Mediterranean, Ottoman Anatolia, and the Balkans. And those bricks were made from local soil that was fired. And that inflamed, preserved, durable object then became the housing, the casing, the container for all residents of this region. So there's something quite profound about the transformation of local soil and local minerals with the vehicle of fire into homeness. But it's kind of a TBD category because the research is just unfolding. Anyway, thank you. Thank you all for wonderful questions.